I wish we did as well. It seems like it would certainly either be very important for us to argue towards the defense or potentially grading material, or that there would certainly be a lot we could use for cross-examination that we won't unfortunately be able to avail ourselves of.
Because you don't know the answers to the questions.
Correct.
Okay, even though I'm not being asked to do so, it might be wise to let them redepose Dr. Burston only on that issue.
Judge, we did not bring it up. It's not part of this trial. It's inappropriate to conduct a deposition when it's something that's not being brought up in the trial by the state. Dr. Burston's already described in a proper hearing as to what it meant. There is no other reason to have a deposition. They got that information out. So I was strongly object to this. It's a delay tactic that's not necessary in this particular case. And Judge, I find that there's no value to it. It's already been presented to them in their full proffer that they were allowed to have for 45 minutes after we said we weren't going to present the evidence and the words. It's 2 words that we were not going to present. All the background, it was descriptive words of all the background factors that Dr. Burston took in effect. We're going to discuss those background factors. They were already presented in deposition and in his report. And we feel that it's not necessary in any way, shape, or form for them to depose him on it.
Okay, it's not going to delay the trial. He can make himself available after he's done for today, hopefully, or at some other time. But I am indicating that I think that is a valid question. They obviously cannot ask him that on the stand. Do you want to just go in the side room and ask him? It may not take some long deposition. Just ask him how that could be.
I would not want to do it not without a court reporter.
Well, she's right here. Go in the side room and say, hey, that solves the problem. Dr. Burston?
Take 2 minutes unless
Okay,
there's a lot of,
2
I mean, I
minutes.
could just answer that question like that, you know, how it could
How it
possibly.
could be McNaughton?
Absolutely.
Do you want to have him do it here, or do you want to go in the side room and do it? Okay, I'm going to bring the jury in, and you can use the court reporter at a break if you decide to do it that way. Okay? Let's bring the jury in, please.
Deputy Royce, line them up, bring them in.
No.
You all right?
So safe to say this is the only witness direct and cross we're going to do today, right?
folks, what are my two questions? Cell phones off?
Yep.
And those are your notepads, correct? Jury's in the jury box and seat, Your Honor.
Thank you. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning. Anybody receive any information outside of court about this case? Okay, and Mr. 1273, you will be able to make your board meeting at 5:30? First one, okay. You'll be able to make your board meeting, and just for your own plans, this is the only witness today, direct and cross and any redirect and recross, but Dr. Burston is the only witness for today. And no problem getting out. What time do you need to leave?
5:30.
Pardon?
5:30.
Oh, that'll be no problem.
Yeah.
Okay, you may proceed.
Doctor, what is the PCLR second edition?
That's the psychopathy checklist revised in its second edition.
Did you administer this in this particular case?
Yes, I did.
Okay. Do you administer this in all such cases of when you're looking at insanity?
No.
Okay. Oh, how do you administer this?
Well, the psychopathy checklist revised is there's a number of items, and each item identifies a characteristic of something it's a more extreme form of antisocial personality disorder known as psychopathy. So the word checklist is a little misleading, because although you see the items on the sheet of paper, you just don't go through and willy-nilly check them. Each item has a certain criteria. There's mandatory training necessary to utilize this instrument. So the evaluator, when they use it, has a general, well, clear, but general sense of what each item is trying to capture. And by evaluating an individual, preferably reviewing records and talking to the individual, for each item you can arrive at a score. 0 where the item's absent, 1 where there's some indication, or 2 where there's indication that the item is, or the trait is fully present. There's also another category, which is omit, which on the form is an X. If you don't have enough information, items can be omitted. So it's a established way to gain information about the presence or absence of a more extreme form of antisocial personality disorder, which is known as psychopathy.
If you don't use it in all your sanity evaluations, why did you use it in this one?
Well, as I read the records and as I talked to the informants, the individuals I spoke about yesterday, I felt that uniformly each individual in their own way were describing Mr. Jonchuck.
Objection. Improper.
Sustained. Do you want to approach?
Yes. When you look through the records and speak to the witnesses, did you discover traits of the defendant that you wanted to look into more closely?
Yes, that's what I was about to say. All the information that I reviewed left me with an impression that I had to go in different directions. Not just this direction, but other directions, to somehow integrate all the information that I was obtaining. So this is one of the ways that I tried to do that.
Now, you said it requires specialized training to administer, I think you call it a checklist. Have you had that kind of training?
Oh, yes.
Would you describe that training for the jury, please?
Well, the Psychopathy Checklist Revised, it really came out of a large body of research that was conducted in the Canadian forensic, criminal/mental health.
Let's stop and approach, please. It's time to have the morning look at the jury suite. I don't think it'll be very long.
Dr. You said you got that kind of training, you were going through it, please go through it.
Well, I think you're asking me about the training, so I was going to say that the instrument was developed by a psychologist by the name of Robert Hare. And Dr. Hare, I went to a workshop that was Dr. Hare gave on the training for the administration of scoring and interpretation of the Psychopathy Checklist Revised. I believe I went to that training in 1990, and then a year or two later had another training with Dr. Hare and one of his students, Adele Forth. I've been trained on the youth version of the Psychopathy Checklist Revised and have been involved in additional trainings, at least 2 or 3 over the years. And it's an instrument that I use. I've used regularly over the years, although certainly not in this type of case. By that I mean insanity case.
That's it, Judge.
All right, let's bring them in.
Pretty right, so go ahead and line them up, bring them back in.
Judge, I know the court took the jury out to address the one issue. There are some other issues. I mean, there's no way for us to attack the validity of it. Would the court like to hear the questioning on cross so there's a complete picture of?
I am going to allow you, I've already thought about this, some space on cross to cross-examine without the typical use of the test coming in. I'm not, because otherwise I preclude you from cross-examining. I'm not going to do that without the rest of that stuff coming in. So we can talk about it later. Let's bring the jury in, please.
All right. Jury's in the jury box and seated.
May I proceed, Mr. Ellis?
I believe you're talking about Dr. Hare had developed this test and your training in this test?
Right. A psychologist by the name of Dr. Robert Hare was the developer of this instrument, and I was asked about my training. I was trained in 1990 by Dr. Hare in the administration, scoring, and the interpretation of the psychopathy checklist revised. A year or two later, I went through another training with Dr. Hare and one of the students by the name of Adele Ford. And then a year or two later, I was also trained by Adele Ford on the use of the psychopathy checklist youth version, you know, for individuals under 18 years of age. And then over the years, as part of my necessary continuing education credits, I've gone to workshops that deal at least partially with the use and scoring, interpretation of the psychopathy checklist revised in the context of broader forensic evaluations.
Judge, I'm going to show the defense counsel a demonstrative aid I'm going to be using. Yeah, I published the jury.
Sure.
Doctor, is that the instrument you used in this particular case?
Yes, that's my scoring as well.
Okay. So there's a pre-printed sheet that comes out, or and that you then score with?
Score on, yes.
Score on?
Yes.
And as you indicated, it says no, maybe, yes, and omit.
Correct.
And no, once again, means what?
No means that that the examiner could not find evidence of that specific trait or characteristics.
And then maybe means?
Maybe means that there's some indication, at least, enough to give it a maybe. At least, I don't score maybe, like maybe it's there, maybe it's not, and scratch my head. I don't do it that way. There has to be some indication.
And then yes?
Yes is that there's, in my opinion, or the examiner's opinion, that there's firm indication of the trait present.
And then there's an omit.
Well, if you can't find information that can tell you one way or another, in that particular area, there just wasn't enough information available on any given trait to make a decision. You know, the examiner has the opportunity to omit.
And on this demonstrative aid, there are 17 different categories. We'll go through them. Category 1 is glibness and superficial charm.
Yes.
What does that mean?
Well, if I could just preface this by being that this really was developed to be a personality test to identify traits or characteristics of individuals. So again, these are personality traits or variables that we're talking about. And when you put them all together, that's what psychopathy really is, you know, the way it's defined. So glibness or superficial charm, the item describes an individual who exudes an insincere, and superficial sort of charm. Amusing, good conversationalist, ready with a quick or clever comeback, places himself in a good light, tells convincing stories, just somebody who you know, is outgoing, gregarious, and has the ability to kind of pull people in with their personality style.
You scored this as a maybe.
I scored it as a 1, yes.
Okay. And why was that?
Well, I have to give examples from the information that I obtained during my examination. Mr. Jonchuck's mother...
You're not going to tell us any collateral witness's opinion? You can tell us specific events.
I understand.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Mr. Jonchuck was described as having a used car salesman type of personality.
Objection.
Sustained.
Can we go on?
Another question.
Okay. Number 2 is grandiose sense of self-worth.
Yes.
What is that?
That has to do with a person who has a grossly inflated sense of their abilities and self-worth. He appears to be self-assured, opinionated, even cocky. Inflated self-worth is in conflict with his actual life experiences.
And you check that as a maybe.
Yes, some indication.
And then this is the need for stimulation, proneness to boredom, number 3.
Yes.
What is that for?
It's an item that describes an individual who demonstrates a chronic or excessive need for exciting stimulation, an unusual proneness to boredom, who usually express a strong need in taking chances, life in the fast lane.
And you check that as a maybe.
Yes.
Number 4, pathological lying.
Yes.
What is that?
Well, that has to do with someone who lies all the time, but beyond that uses lies in some sort of a malevolent kind of way, perhaps to hurt people, to create conflicts between people. It's just beyond not telling the truth. The lying actually has repercussions, greater repercussions in terms of relationships with people.
And you check that as a 2, a yes?
Yes.
And this was, you scored this after interviewing the defendant.
Objection.
Finish the question, and I'll go ahead and I'll roll.
You scored this after interviewing the defendant and reading through the materials and talking to collateral witnesses?
Yes.
Overruled.
Number 5 is cunning and manipulative.
Yes.
What is that?
Well, all of these descriptions are basically from the manual for the instrument. This item describes an individual who uses deceit, deception, to cheat, bilk, defraud, or manipulate others, schemes and scams that are carried out with no concern for the effect on victims.
Okay. Number 6 is lack of remorse or guilt. You scored that as a yes as well.
Yes, I do.
What is lack of remorse or guilt?
It describes an
Again,
individual.
objection.
Overruled.
It describes an individual who shows a general lack of concern for the negative consequences that his actions have on others. He's more concerned with the effects that his actions have upon himself as opposed to how his behavior may affect others.
And number 7 is shallow affect. What does that mean?
A shallow affect, again, affects emotion. It describes an individual who appears unable to experience a normal range of depth of emotion. This can include being cold and unemotional. Emotion can be brief, dramatic, shallow, and short-lived. This includes play acting.
And you scored that as a yes.
Yes.
Number 8 says callous or lack of empathy.
Yes.
How is that different than number 6, which is lack of remorse or guilt?
Well, callous and lack of empathy describes an individual whose attitudes and behaviors indicate a profound lack of empathy and a callous disregard for the feelings, rights, and welfare of others. So the individual is described as just concerned with himself, and others are just objects for gratification, manipulation, and no hesitation to mock others, for example. So comparing that to number 6, I mean, I just have to look again at the lack of guilt and remorse. I think that it goes beyond just guilt and remorse. It has to do with how lack of guilt and remorse really allows, lack of empathy allows a person free rein to, again, use other people. You bring up an interesting topic. There's a lot of what we call internal consistency between the items.
What does that mean?
That means that they overlap and to a large degree measure variations of the same thing. If someone's conning and manipulative, which means that they're always running scams on someone, they're likely to have some degree of callousness and lack of remorse, for example. If you see big conflicts between the scores consistently, it just doesn't quite make sense. There has to be, because you're evaluating an individual has this, if they have a core cluster of psychopathy features, there's consistency as we go through the list.
So that is sort of built into the PCLR second?
Yes, yes, with all psychological tests, tests are constructed, very detailed. There's all sorts of statistics, and certainly something called internal consistency, items to some degree measuring the same thing, is part of the construction of the test.
And if you score it and don't have that internal consistency, is that a problem?
Well, I think you're talking about something called inter-rater reliability, which has to do with if 2 raters administer the test, and it's related to what I was just talking about, but it has to do more with the people using the test.
Okay.
Are they kind of seeing the same picture of the same person vis-a-vis this test?
I got you. Number 9 is parasitic lifestyle.
Well, parasitic lifestyle is someone who is financially dependent on others, and that's a kind of key aspect of the person's lifestyle. They avoid steady gainful employment. They rely on family, relatives, friends, social assistance. They often present themselves as being helpless, and may even using threats or coercion to get what they want. And it's usually in terms of, material types of needs.
And you obviously check that as a yes as well?
Yes.
Poor behavioral controls, number 10. What is that?
Well, that's, I guess, the test developer's term for poor anger management, but it's a little different than anger management because this item describes an individual who has poor anger management, but it can be very rapid. Instead of staying angry for a long time, the person can be angry, blow up, and then just go back and be nice, calm, sweet, and go about their life until the next blow up. So it's someone who's very hot-headed, gets angry very quickly, it can dissipate very quickly. There's a very angry response to frustration. It can include acting out of aggression, verbal abuse, and also someone who is very sensitive, takes very easy to, if you say something to the person and they don't like it, they explode.
And you check that as a yes as well?
Yes.
Now, number 11 is promiscuous sexual behavior, but you've got it circled as a maybe with an arrow towards yes. What is that?
Well, promiscuous sexual behavior is probably self-explanatory. When you're trained on the test, they talk about using what they call a slider, which means if you think that there's one score and you think that it could be a score lower or higher, you can score it the way that I did. I scored that a 1, and there's some potential that there could be a 2, but I wasn't clear enough on it to go forward. So I kept it as a 1. I scored it as a 1, but for my mind's eye, I kept in mind that it could be a 2.
So the benefit of the doubt goes to the lower score?
I think throughout, yes.
Okay. Number 12 is early behavioral problems.
Well, I think that that's apparent. Someone who, at a very early age, started to display very intense behavioral problems, and I gave Mr. Jonchuck a 2 on that.
Okay. Lack of realistic long-term goals, number 13.
Yes, that's someone who really has an inability or unwillingness to carry out realistic plans and goals. They float around from place to place. They plan to do things which they never do.
Would that be like saying you're going to go to college or hair school and then not going?
Well, that would be one way, but also living from place to place, not really formulating real goals other than very immediate short-term goals, like if I can't stay here, can I go there?
Number 14 is impulsivity. You also scored that as a 2 or a yes.
Right, and that's just an item that describes an individual whose behavior is generally impulsive, not well thought out, lacking in reflection, forethought, leap before you think type of thing.
Number 15 is irresponsibility.
Well, it's an individual who, you know, has a pattern habitually.
Objection.
Sustained.
Is this from the manual that you're getting this?
Yeah.
Just can we approach?
Sustained.
Can we approach, Judge? Failure to accept responsibility for his own actions, number 16. You covered that one, obviously, as a yes as well.
Yes.
And last would be many short-term marital relationships.
Well, the term marital is used to describe someone who is having a live-in relationship, full-time. It could be not a paramour relationship, doesn't have to be marital. It could be anyone who's with a paramour for at least like 4, 6, 7 months consistently. And if someone, well, so there, you could either score 0, 1, or 2, and there's actually criteria for how many relationships of that type would be a 0 or a 1 or a 2.
And is that what that little asterisk at the end of that
yes,
means?
that would identify how many relationships were a score beyond 0.
And under the manual, he didn't score anything but a 0 on that.
0 because Michelle Curry was the only paramour that Mr. Jonchuck lived with for any length of time. His roommates were not romantic relationships.
Upon completing this checklist and the scoring, what did that lead you to conclude in your evaluation of the defendant?
Well, first and foremost, those traits or characteristics clearly are present in this case, and based on the total profile, I would say that there's an extreme level of psychopathy types of features that I could apply to Mr. Jonchuck, and again, that would reflect a more extreme level of antisocial personality disorder. Psychopathy is actually a specifier.
What does that mean?
Well, antisocial personality disorder, which we talked about yesterday and you saw the chart, was already described, but diagnoses in the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, many of them have specifiers. A very simple example would be major depression. If someone has major depression and they also hear voices, then it's major depression with psychotic features. That's the specifier. So with antisocial personality disorder, with psychopathy, that's speaking to a more severe level of antisocial personality disorder that would specifically refer to the types of features that we just went over.
Okay. And antisocial personality disorder is one of the diagnoses that you formed in this particular case?
Yes.
Okay. And you said that makes it a more extreme version of that?
Yes, I would say severe.
Severe?
Yeah.
Okay. And you were aware that there were statements that the Swedish Bible was knocking, and those kind of things. How did that information impact you?
Well, when I reviewed the records, that information is stands out to a mental health professional, at least, in the records being depositions, police reports, arrest-related information. And not, when we talk about the Swedish Bible knocking, it's that and everything else that you've probably heard quite a bit of. Again, Mr. Jonchuck believing at times that he was God, believing he's the Pope, assaulting the doors and the windows around his father's house. All of that information, all of the psychotic symptoms, when I reviewed the records, they jumped out at me. As I got further into the case, discussing a lot of the stuff I've already discussed, I saw that there were a lot of other things in this case, which certainly includes major mental illness, but other factors, other variables that I believe are part of a broad forensic examination that I had to give equal attention to in my evaluation. It'd be very easy to say all of those psychotic symptoms were present, and therefore Mr. Jonchuck, because those symptoms are present, he had to be legally insane. The symptoms can be present, but there were a lot of other variables present. Again, the presence of personality disorder, a history of aggression, a history of other antisocial types of behavior, a history of substance abuse, a history of relationship instability, a history of employment instability, all these things. So I had to look at those things as one side of the coin, and the psychotic symptoms as the other side of the coin, and figure out how all these things fit, and ended up contributing to the most important part of the evaluation, what Mr. Jonchuck was thinking and feeling at the time of the offense, which is on the bridge at that moment. So one of the reasons I went down the other side of the coin, so to speak, is because it was very easy looking at the psychotic symptoms to kind of fall into what's called conformatory bias.
What is conformatory bias?
Well, conformatory bias is getting, what it would have been for me, it's the best way to explain it, reading that information, which again jumped out at me very clearly as I went through all the records, and sort of said, this guy was having definite psychotic symptoms, and what he did on the bridge, did a crazy thing on the bridge, so link them together or have a predisposition to link them together just right off the bat. And as I got further into my investigation, which just kind of unfolds, you never know what's going to happen when you evaluate someone. I mean, you have to go with the flow, and these other aspects of Mr. Jonchuck emerged, and I followed up on them. I had some other hypotheses to kind of sort out about what might have led to Mr. Jonchuck's mental state at the time of the offense on the bridge.
So you were looking at on the bridge, whether the defendant had the premeditated intent to kill her, or he committed the felony murder of aggravated child abuse?
Well, I didn't think in those terms. I thought in the terms of a forensic mental health professional.
Which was what?
Which was, at the time of the offense, Mr. Jonchuck had a mental disease or deficit, mental illness, and obviously I believe he did. And then I thought about, due to the presence of the mental illness, did he understand what he was doing and or the wrongfulness of his behavior, including the consequences of his action.
And what is it at the bridge that you were looking at?
Well, I was looking at his mental state at that time.
Okay. Were you looking at the violent act that he had committed?
Well, obviously, when I say the bridge, I'm talking about ultimately, the murder of Phoebe.
Are there different types of violence?
Yes, there are.
And what are they?
Well, there's
Objection, relevance.
Jury's out of the hearing report, Your Honor.
There's 3 types of violence, Doctor?
Yes, there are.
And what are they?
Well, one type of violence, you can call it emotional violence, has to do with, I'll give an example. You know, 2 guys are in a bar and one guy says something about the other guy's wife, and spontaneously, immediately, the guy punches him. That would just be impulsive, emotional violence. The other type of violence is more of a planned violence where the same situation, but the guy decides not to punch him because the guy's too big, the other guy's too big. So he waits till the next night, and when the guy stumbles out of the bar, he hits him from behind. So there's more of a planned type of violence.
What's the 3rd type?
Well, the 3rd type of violence, which is a pattern that I think applies here, at least in my professional opinion, has to do with a conflict between intimates that begins at some point and persists over a period of time. It can be days, it can be months. And for the person who ends up being the actor-outer of the violence, that conflict persists, and sort of like a teapot on a hot stovetop, the conflict percolates, starts to slowly percolate, then it starts to slowly simmer, starts to boil, and at some point, as we've all heard teapots, it starts screaming quite loud. So what I'm trying to describe is a conflict that builds and builds and builds till it explodes.
And jumping ahead, is the conflict evidence that we're going to be addressing with the defendant?
Yes.
Any questions from the proper?
May I have just a minute, Your Honor?
Sure.
Sure.
That, Doctor, good morning.
Morning.
The 3rd type of violence you described, is that what we earlier were talking about as catathymic violence?
It would fit that pattern most definitely, yes.
And so the violence that Mr. Jonchuck displayed fits catathymic violence.
It's that pattern, it's the same pattern that I discussed in my report, that there was a buildup of tensions. There were other aggravators besides just the situation between he and Michelle Kerr. So there were other aggravators contributing to that buildup. You want me to tell you what they are? I'm happy to. If you know what I'm saying.
Tell me this, is catathymic violence relative to the McNaughton standard?
Well, I'm happy to answer that question. In some cases, it most definitely can be, and in some cases, it most definitely wouldn't be. And if you want to know the reason why, I'm happy to tell you. I think that's what you were asking before. So I told you to take a second.
And Judge, I certainly don't.
Just ask a question and I'll say yes or no. If there's
Okay.
an objection.
What I'm asking for then is an opportunity to depose him.
So you have no more questions now?
Correct.
Okay.
Because I don't know which way to go.
Well, there's no jury in here. Who cares which way it goes?
Well, all right. Before you tell me what shows in this case that he wasn't, that his catathymic violence is not indicative of insanity, can you tell me how it can be indicative of insanity?
Very simply, catathymic violence, not so simply, but at the beginning simply. Catathymic violence generally occurs in two mental states. One is a psychotic mental state, and one is, it occurs in individuals have significant borderline personality disorder or organization. So obviously, if it's determined that it's the psychosis that built up and built up and built up and exploded on the bridge, then that could be grounds for not guilty by reason of insanity. If it's, again, that term differential diagnosis, that it's more readily the maladaptive personality traits and characteristics, then it would be more reflective of unbridled anger, if that's a correct, I'm trying to use terms appropriate with the court, rather than a distorted psychotic mindset. So, yes, it could be grounds for an insanity defense. Obviously, you know that I think that it swings the other way. But that's the answer to your question. It could go either way. The pattern can even manifest itself in the psychotic symptoms associated with it could result in the murder, or the personality disorder symptoms can result in the murder, explosion, whatever you want to call it.
So the catathymic violence, if it's caused by psychosis, is an indication of insanity?
If it's determined that the psychotic symptoms, catathymic violence is just a pattern, okay? So if it's determined at the end of the day, or on the bridge here for our case, that it was a buildup of psychotic symptoms, then it certainly could be a grounds for NGI. If it's a buildup of, and someone can have either or, but what's the driving force here? If it's more personality based, then it wouldn't be, and that's how I see it.
And have you heard other testimony from any other experts that what happened fit catathymic violence pattern?
I mean, has it ever been discussed before?
In this case?
In this case. I described it in my report and in my deposition. I didn't use the term, okay? So there's nothing being, there's no attempt to pull anything out of my back pocket and blindside. I described very clearly the conflict, the buildup, and that resulted in my opinion, in what transpired. And I said in the last page of my report that I looked at both sides, and I'm obviously going to talk about that here. So you're not, the term, I understand your concern with the term. I told you right like that yesterday, we don't need to use that term. I haven't even said it once today, I don't think. I don't need to. It's a pattern of violence. And I believe that it was more driven by Mr. Jonchuck's personality his relationship history and all the things I've talked about, as opposed to the psychotic symptoms that he clearly had.
Yeah, and that's where you've lost me. So we have a pattern of violence, and that pattern of violence is either personality-driven or psychosis-driven.
And I looked at it both ways.
Okay. Now, what I want to know is, can experts differ on whether there was a pattern of violence, or do all experts in this case agree there was this pattern of violence?
I would assume that experts disagree about everything frequently. So I can't speak for other people, but I see this pattern of violence, and all I can do with any expert can do is describe how they see a case and the reasons why from a professional vantage point. So I see a pattern, I'm going to forget the word catathymic, where there was a conflict that grew over time. I can support the facts that lead to that, and I can support why I don't think that it was why I think there were psychotic symptoms present for Mr. Jonchuck, but why I don't think that the psychotic symptoms, in my opinion, were the culprit.
Right.
And I again differentiated between the two.
Okay, so if there is no, I know you're not using the term, but I mean, it is catathymic violence that you're describing, right?
Well, I'm describing a pattern. That's a name that's been ascribed to it, but I'm describing a pattern which was in my report without the name, and it was that things were building and building and building for Mr. Jonchuck until he exploded. And I mean, I said this in my report. I said in my depot, I talked about the difference. I looked at the psychotic stuff. I looked at the personality stuff. Nothing different than I've said all along.
Okay, so if we don't have that pattern, then is there still, in other words, if we have that pattern, it's either this or this, correct?
What's this or this?
Well, it's either psychosis or personality driven.
That's my opinion, and I described the pattern in my report. Again, there's no blind side going on.
Okay, so if we have that pattern and it's psychosis driven, would your opinion be that he was insane?
Yes.
Okay. Now, if he doesn't have that pattern, in other words, if that pattern does not exist, and you said other experts could find that pattern does not exist?
Well, other experts read my report. It's in my report, so I don't know what else to tell you. I mean, all I can tell you is that this isn't new information. You're hung up on a name, but this is all stuff that I mean, I emailed my report to the state attorney's office. I'll look at the date. I mean, I don't know when you got it, but I mean, this is not new. I don't know how else to say it.
Judge, we've asked and answered these questions several times. This is way beyond what was the original purpose for the proffer. I think they've now conducted the deposition that the court was going to let them conduct, because that's what they're doing now in the middle of the trial, and I think we've reached a point where we should be allowed to go forward with a direct testimony.
Okay, I'm going to hear argument as to why it should or should not come in. Mr. Williams?
I have one last question, because regarding when this information was provided.
Okay, one last question and that's it.
Okay. Can you tell us where in your report or depot you use the term pattern of violence?
I'm sorry, you had a question.
Well, right here on the end of the last paragraph, page 23, consistent with such acute stressors, there is every reason to believe that Mr. Jonchuck experienced an escalation in feelings of rejection, feelings of jealousy, and feelings of rage. It was at this point that the defendant drove to the bridge and proceeded to murder his daughter. So what I'm describing is an escalation in certain thoughts and feelings that led to behavior. It's up to you attorneys to argue that I didn't use a specific word, but I think I clearly described that there was an ongoing buildup of tension, conflict, not just with the potential custody issue, but other issues that led to the murder.
Judge, just so you know, if we were in a deposition process, I would follow up on that, but you gave me one question, I understand.
Okay, so any argument you have, Mr. Williams, about why this should come in?
Judge, in Gerganis v. Well, one, according to the testimony that was just elicited, this is a pattern to show that Mr. Jonchuck acted in conformity with it. Now, the rules do allow when that is admissible. Evidence of a person's character or a trait of character is inadmissible to prove action in conformity with it on a particular occasion, except character of accused, evidence of a pertinent trait of character offered by an accused or by the prosecution to rebut that trait. We have not offered any evidence of a specific trait. Character of victim would not apply, character of witness would not apply. The pattern of violence, that question was specifically just asked to Dr. Burston. Where does pattern of violence, where is that found in your report? Where is that phrase found in your depo? He was unable to provide a location. It is not in his report or in his depo where he uses that he is employing a pattern of violence in order to prove this case. I'm looking at Gerganis v. State, G-U-R-G-A-N-U-S. This is Supreme Court of Florida from 1984, 451 Southern 2nd, 817. This case, actually the defense had sought to call two psychologists in order to offer an opinion in an insanity case. The court did not allow it. The Supreme Court held that it was not error to not allow that because the proffered opinion, the proffered testimony of the two psychologists shows that their opinions, based upon personal examination of defendant and the hypothetical scenario of defendant previously ingesting a whole bunch of pills and alcohol, were that the defendant was not in effective control of his behavior, that he had a mental defect, and that his judgment would have been seriously impaired. When asked specifically about his ability to distinguish right from wrong, neither psychologist was able to state within a reasonable degree of certainty that he had that ability. They go on and on. The second issue that I think is the more important issue is whether the second issue, whether the defendant's behavior at the time of the offense more closely resembled a depraved mind than a premeditated plan. And the defense wanted to ask that. The state said that, or the court held that that was an improper scope of expert testimony and didn't allow it. The Supreme Court said that that was the right ruling, said the facts included the assumption that the defendant had used drugs and alcohol fluently prior to the offense. The defense attorney asked each psychologist to give his opinion as to whether the defendant's actions were closer to a depraved mind than to a premeditated plan. The trial court refused to allow either psychologist to render an opinion, stating that regardless of the opinion, the testimony would not be allowed to go to the jury on the grounds that it was irrelevant and an improper infringement on the issue properly to be decided by the jury. They said that we find that the opinions the psychologists were asked to give in this case were not the proper subject of expert testimony. The defense was attempting to elicit a bottom line opinion as to whether the actions of the defendant were those of a depraved mind or a premeditated plan. Both of those terms are legal terms with specific legal definitions. Essentially, the defense was attempting to elicit the psychologist's opinions as to whether the defendant committed second-degree or first-degree murder. Such a conclusion was a legal conclusion, no better suited to expert opinion than to lay opinion, and as such was an issue to be determined solely within the province of the jury. And then, so in this situation, what Dr. Burston is essentially, not essentially, he has said a number of times now throughout his testimony that he believes it was premeditated, it was in conformity with this specific plan. If the court does find that it is admissible or that it would be relevant, the issue then is whether the court then needs to do a 403 analysis. And certainly by introducing evidence, any testimony that comes in through an expert witness is inherently dangerous for the jury because that's given more weight inherently just by who it comes from. And the Supreme Court has held that that certainly needs to be something to take into consideration when allowing testimony to come from an expert's opinion. So to have Dr. Burston, one, go so far as to make the legal conclusion whether that this is premeditated, in doing so using a pattern of violence. He has indicated that it's a pattern that is consistent with his personality that they just ran through the traits. So that is improper. If the court finds that that's relevant, though, certainly the prejudicial effect would very obviously outweigh any minimal relevance that there is. In order for the court to allow this pattern testimony, the court has to do a 403 analysis on that as well. And so we can't tell you exactly how prejudicial, because again, we're just learning this as we all are on the stand, and so certainly we are not able to process the information, research the information, consult any research in psychology articles or with any of our experts as we're all learning this together. But just on the little bit we are able to learn that we are aware of at this point based on Dr. Burston's testimony, we believe it cannot commit, Judge.
Okay, let me just say something about Cardenas. My memory of that case is that the ruling was that the defense was trying to backdoor drug addiction to establish some kind of irresistible impulse which would be kind of consistent with second-degree murder, and that it wasn't really McNaughton, so it wasn't allowed. I could be wrong, but that's what I thought that case said. Additionally, the argument that jurors respect experts' testimony and it carries great weight, I don't think the reality is true. I think jurors customarily kind of disregard it and call it a tie and make up their own mind on some other factors. I am not going to allow Dr. Burston to testify as to any legal conclusion as to whether or not, if it wasn't NGRI, it was premeditated or not. I don't consider his change of words, calling something a pattern as opposed to something else, and those clearly are synonymous terms when you talk about life-violent events culminating in a murder. I think one could call it a pattern or any number of things. Just because he uses a separate word at the trial doesn't mean that the whole thing is derailed. Do you have any additional arguments, Mr. Ellis?
No, Judge.
Okay, so I'm going to allow that testimony in. Obviously, you're not giving us a legal conclusion about first-degree murder or second-degree murder.
I'm not an expert in that.
Well, they're the experts on that.
Right, so no,
Okay.
nothing, no.
Okay.
No.
Let's have the jury back in, please. No offense intended, yes. No offense intended, the jury.
Jury's in the jury box and seated, John.
Doctor, I think you were talking about 3 types of violence.
Can you just repeat the question, please?
I believe you were starting to discuss there were like 3 types of violence.
Well, I think you asked me about that. Yeah, there's basically, well, not basically, there are 3, to give an example of patterns of violence. One example would be, an immediate emotional response. Someone says something negative to their friend, and their friend immediately punches them. It just happens very emotionally on the spot. Someone might say the same negative thing to their friend, but the friend knows better than to punch the guy because the guy's much bigger and stronger, so he waits until his ex-friend is not looking, and he hits him with a stick in the back of the head. So, there's a little bit of a pause, a wait, a little bit of planning involved. And then there's another pattern, if you want to call it that, of how violence kind of happens. That has to do with relationships between intimates, family members, husband, wife, lovers, paramours, and that has to do with a conflict that develops, and this can go on for days, weeks, couple months. There's no time period, but for the person who eventually acts out the violence, that conflict over time begins to escalate. And I think the easiest way for me to try to explain that is think of a teapot on top of a hot stove. First you put it on, there's no sound. You start to hear a little sound. It starts to simmer, it starts to percolate, and finally it's screaming, screaming exceptionally loud. So that's kind of what I'm talking about, is for the person who enacts the violence over time. They think about the conflict, they think about the conflict, and while they're thinking about the conflict, they might be thinking about ways to resolve it and ruminating over things of an aggressive or violent intent to solve the conflict. The important thing to keep in mind with this type of a situation is that there's a tremendous pressure building, just like that teapot. And so at some point the building occurs, and there's, again, the explosion. That's basically a type of violence that I saw is relevant here.
So the third one you saw is relevant?
Yes.
Okay. And can you explain how that applies to this case?
Well, in Mr. Jonchuck's case, we all know that at the very least, his concerns of custody concerning between Michelle Kerr dates back to August of 2014. Probably dates back sooner, but we know that that's when he first contacted Ms. Torres, and then she didn't have any further contact with him until December 31st of 2014. So I assume that for a long time these tensions they didn't go away, but they were, I guess for lack of better terms, they were barely simmering or slowly simmering. And then, again, Thanksgiving of 2014, there was contact between Mr. Jonchuck, Phoebe, Ms. Kerr, Ms. Kerr's then boyfriend. That contact was described as, it was a good meeting. I mean, there were no conflicts or no problems. When I say good meeting, that everything was okay. And they met again at Christmas. And as I said yesterday, Mr. Jonchuck's mother was there at that time as well. And that was described as an okay visit as well. And by that I mean everybody said that there were no problems. But it was after that, again, between Christmas Eve and New Year's Eve, that Mr. Jonchuck called. Well, there was that drama in that week's period of time, and I think that's indication that things were flaring up. I think of the teapot flaring up. At 4:30 on New Year's Eve, the first phone call to Ms. Torres, and I think at that point there's an indication of greater concern on Mr. Jonchuck's part. And then we know that after they had the first meeting available, which was on the 6th, and things escalated from there. I think that there were a number of phone calls, and certainly there was an escalating concern on Mr. Jonchuck's part. I believe that there's evidence that there was some violent ideation or rumination during that period.
Did you say
of time.
rumination?
Yes. Like
What do you mean by that?
Thinking over and over and over again.
Okay.
I believe that there was some evidence of that, and I think that this was a buildup of a long-standing conflict. There were a number of other things going on at that point, but I think when we talk about how this moved over time, I think that that's an important consideration.
Now, we yesterday received some police reports from the defense regarding Hillsborough County and some domestic battery arrest of Guy Kisser, the new boyfriend of Michelle Kerr. Kisser committed the violence on Michelle Kerr. What impact does that have on your evaluation?
Well, I reviewed those records, and they were dated January 3rd. It doesn't have, well, first of all, that doesn't affect anything I've said about Thanksgiving, Christmas Eve, New Year's Eve, so it's January 3rd. At that point, there's been some, well, on the second, some more emails between Mr. Jonchuck and Ms. Torres, so again, things were flaring up. And the domestic violence that occurred between Michelle Kerr and Guy Kisser, doesn't really affect me in any way. Mr. Jonchuck had concerns. He told me that he had concerns about their relationship. He told me that after, I believe it's the December visit, when the drama started occurring between Ms. Kerr and himself, and Mr. Kisser was involved in that drama too. It was a bit of a triangle. He had called the Department of Children and Families and described that there were problems in that household, in Mr. Kisser and Ms. Kerr's household. So I think that he was concerned about problems there, and this would have just been another problem. And if he's concerned about custody, this would be more, potentially more of a, throwing gasoline on the fire, more of a reason that he would want to take care of the custody issue. And of course, he did call Ms. Torres. He saw her. He called her regularly. So I think, if anything, this just inflamed what was going on. On one hand, he was concerned about that Michelle Kerr had a boyfriend in a stable situation, so that was a threat to him. But that doesn't take away the fact that that after Christmas, the issue of custody became much more a real issue on Michelle Kerr's part. So there was still, that conflict was definitely there.
Did you see evidence of the defendant's rumination during this time period as we're getting closer to the murder?
Yes.
And what were those?
Well, one aspect of that rumination or thinking about some way to relieve that pressure is he told his mother, I'm really going to fuck up your life. And that was on the morning of the 3rd. That's my opinion, one indication that things were percolating pretty steadily at that point. Another one was that when he left Ms. Torres' office on the 7th, he said, none of this will matter tomorrow. And I think that statement certainly has implications. And then he had a preoccupation with bridges, people jumping off bridges and bridges. And as we know, that's the crime scene here. So there was definitely, in my opinion, indication of this rumination going on as the pressure built.
Did you review the video from the Manatee County Police Department?
Yes.
In that video, the defendant appears calm. How does that play into your analysis and evaluation?
Well, we can all have our interpretations. I think he seemed tired, kind of lethargic, spent. Those are my opinions, or my interpretations of the video everyone watched. And, you know, we talk about that teapot boiling up, and spewing. Just like anything, after physically, after someone exerts a lot of tension, there's a period of being spent, calm. And so I can attribute some of what I saw, or what I interpreted, seeing in terms of Mr. Jonchuck's lethargic, tired kind of demeanor at the Manatee Sheriff's Office to being, you know, all of that's been expelled, that tension's been expelled.
So this team has been let out of the pot?
Yes.
What is psychotic ideation?
Well, psychotic ideation is the things that have been talked about by the other experts and myself. You know, the hearing voices, having delusions, irrational beliefs that you think clearly are real.
How did you apply that to your evaluation of this case?
Well, this pattern that I talked about, it kind of got me further along in my investigation, but it's at the same time it left me in the same place, because this.
What do you mean by that?
Well, this type of pattern, it's most likely to occur in two mental states. And one mental state can be psychosis, and another mental state can be significant borderline personality disorder, or what we call borderline personality organization. And so people who have either of those conditions can be vulnerable to this pattern, because it can excite, this pattern can occur due to irrational psychotic issues or due to core personality disorder issues such as loss, abandonment, rejection, retaliation, you know, poor control of anger.
How did you apply it to those two different mental states?
Well, I had to look at both possibilities. I had to look at both possibilities and see which one for me fit. So I certainly looked at the end result of Phoebe's death, which has to do with Mr. Jonchuck's mental state at the time of the offense on the bridge, as being a result of his psychotic symptoms. You know, an easy way to say that, we all know what those symptoms are, connecting the dots to the bridge versus another potential application, which is that it had to do more with his patterns of thinking, feeling, and interacting with other people. So I went through both of those types of hypotheses the best that I could.
And how did you do that?
Well, let's start with the psychotic side of things. When I spoke with Mr. Jonchuck, of course I asked him questions about his mental state at the time of the offense, and you know, he explained to me the onset of the symptoms beginning around Christmas time, and they're all the symptoms that you've heard over and over again. So it's just skipping ahead, because I know that there were psychotic symptoms going on. How did they make, you know, again, connecting the dots to the bridge? And so the first, you know, why did he leave his father's house the night of the 7th? Okay, because that's where he left to go to the bridge.
Okay.
And Mr. Jonchuck told me that he thought an ice age was upon us, and that he took Phoebe to drive south to avoid the ice age. So so I start there.
Okay, go ahead.
And obviously he drives to the bridge. Well, the first thing I think about is back when I'm talking to him is that I had read the police report, is that he had stopped on his own on the bridge. So I asked him about that, and he told me that Officer Vickers had pulled him over. So my first hypothesis is, well, Mr. Jonchuck was experiencing psychotic symptoms. He may have been confused. But when he left the bridge, you know, he didn't travel south. I mean, he traveled south till he could get to I-75, and then he went north. So now delusions are very strong things. They're misperceptions that the individual thinks are real. And my view of that pattern is that if this was a true delusion about the ice age, that Mr. Jonchuck would not have stopped on the bridge, and he certainly would have continued to drive south. So I have a little problem with that in terms of, trying to say it's the psychotic stuff that contributed to his behavior on the bridge. But the real issue was what he did, which was that he dropped Phoebe over the edge of the bridge.
What do you mean by that?
Well, I had to talk to him about what was going on in his mind, what he was thinking and feeling at that time. And so I asked him specifically about that. And he told me basically what he told two other doctors, that's Dr. Mathis, Dr. Otto, that when he was on the bridge, he felt that the world was going to end. And the only way he could prevent that was to kill himself and to kill Phoebe. He told me that the devil was talking to him. He told Dr. Mathis that he thought he was God, but really the same story to at least three of the doctors that you've heard. Now we have to talk about delusions for a minute. Again, they're very, very powerful things. They've been portrayed as a bad dream or a dream, that they're not real, but the person thinks they're real and they make sense. People pluck out their eyes because they have delusional beliefs that they have to do that. People cut off their ears. People do all kinds of things because the delusion drives them. Now, if this is a psychotically driven delusion as part of that teapot I'm talking about, it's even that more powerful. Plus, it's a very powerful delusion that he has to save the world. I mean, that's an incredibly powerful delusion, that he's God, or the devil's talking to him. So you have an incredibly powerful delusion that's telling him that. And he doesn't follow the delusion.
What does that mean in your analysis?
Well, my analysis is that if the delusion was telling him to save the world, he had to kill himself and Phoebe. I don't understand, from what I know about delusions, what I've just tried to describe, particularly this one, which I'm looking at as kind of a culmination, that teapot culmination, and it's such a strong thing. I'm God, I have to save the world. The devil's talking to me, and the delusion, it isn't followed. He drops Phoebe over the edge, and he leaves. So in terms of looking at this from a psychotic perspective, I understand the symptoms are there, but connecting the dots, the real issue is connecting the dots to the bridge, in my opinion. Because when I do an evaluation of mental state at the time of the offense, the first criteria is, does somebody have a mental illness, mental disease or deficit? That's there, there's no doubt. But how does it get to the crime itself? How does it factor in specifically to the murder? If I say I can't connect those dots, then I'm really saying, in my opinion, that the first prong of the insanity defense is met. And so I'm just going to transpose it onto what was going on the bridge, that the mental illness is there and he did a horrific, quote-unquote, crazy thing. He must have been crazy. I feel I have to see the mental illness, how the mental illness specifically leads to the act, the crime. And I didn't see that here. So that was very important to me. Number one, I could not trust Mr. Jonchuck's descriptions of what happened. I had to look at the other side of things, much more from the personality side of things.
That's the borderline personality disorder you previously described?
Right, with the antisocial and related psychopathy. I mean, this is a lot of what's driven him throughout his life. It's a lot of what's driven him.
So how did you apply it to that side of it?
Well, I want to take one step back because we've talked quite a bit about the symptoms that were going on in the last 3 weeks, 2 weeks prior to the murder, the psychotic symptoms. But when I read the records, I was fully aware of them. They jumped out at me. But I also read that during that time period, there were periods of what I would call adequate or typical reality testing.
What does that mean?
Well, reality testing is that somebody's in the here and now. They're aware of what's going on. And as opposed to being, completely floridly psychotic.
And what examples of reality testing did you see?
Well, I'm going to have to refer to some notes, if that's okay. overstep any boundaries. Do you want to ask me some questions?
Well, why don't we start with Thanksgiving, Ms. Kerr?
Well, going back to as far back as November, Mr. Jonchuck was described as being normal. There was no indication of any psychotic symptoms. Now that's, you know, relatively far back, but just starting there was no indication.
Well, we moved ahead till around Christmas time.
Christmas, that visit was described as being very good. His mother was there. John was happy, no problems. He said a dinner blessing with the family, so there was no, you know, spilling over of the religious stuff. His mood was fine. There's indication from, I read Guy Kisser's deposition, that Mr. Jonchuck went outside at one point and was observed kind of with his head down muttering to himself.
How did you take that into consideration?
Well, I'm not denying that he might have been hearing voices, or he could have just been not happy with the situation. But even if he was hearing voices, there was no significant indication by the people there that he was impaired. Michelle Kerr indicated to me he wasn't. His mother indicated that to me. Guy Kisser indicated in his depo. So I don't believe that when we're up to Christmas Eve,
correct,
that there was any severe indication or any even mild indication of psychotic symptoms. And again, Mr. Jonchuck said that these symptoms started around Christmas time. When he took Phoebe in the early morning of the 5th, he was very, very angry with his mother. He indicated that he was going to fuck up her life. There was no discussion of anything religious at that time. Nothing at all. Nothing psychotic, in my opinion.
We talked about the statements that he made to the mother.
Yes.
Okay. Previously. After that, on the night of the murder, was he at his father's house?
Well, yes, he was at his father's house. I spoke with both his...
Tell us about that.
Well, I spoke with both his father and his mother, because his mother came over concerning what was going on at that time. This is early in the evening of the 7th. The mother saw him at the dad's house. Everything was okay. She described it as a nice visit. He had his Bible. She just said he had an evil smile. And they made plans for the next day. The plans were that, that John was going to take Phoebe to school, the mother would pick her up, and they'd have dinner together. So they're certainly making, again, reality-based plans, no indication of psychotic symptoms. And then actually, you know, later in the evening, he had called his mother and wanted to come over again, and she told him no.
Okay. And what impact, if any, does that have?
Well, again, we're talking about the evening of the 7th, and we know that Phoebe died early morning of the 8th. So I'm seeing, and this is really just based on one informant and the deposition of that informant, that things are not, there's no indication. Now, I'm not saying that the psychosis wasn't there, but again, on the other side, there was periods of adequate reality testing. My take on it is Mr. Jonchuck, without a doubt, was unraveling. The degree of the unraveling at that point was I can't put a percentage on it, but there was a balance of reality testing and unraveling, in my opinion.
Did that evening, did he try to go see a friend?
Yes, he did.
Who was that?
Noemi. I have a hard time with the last name, but Noemi.
You spelled that before Bresnahan?
Yeah, I'd have to look, yes.
This is the evening of the 7th?
This is the evening of the 7th, yes.
And he went to her residence?
He left, yes, with Phoebe.
With Phoebe?
Yes, went to her residence.
And was he able to go into a residence and have contact with her?
No, he wasn't.
How did that occur?
Well, they had text conversations, and he wanted to go into the residence. He was implying he wanted to go into the residence. He was implying that he and Noemi should be together. Noemi reported to me that around that time he wanted to move in with her, and she kept asking him, "Go away, go away, go away." and he did not go away. And then she said the texting stopped when she said she was going to call the police. So that evening, that's somewhere around 9:30, 9:45, I think there was some goal direction in terms of wanting, he didn't have anywhere else to stay. His residence was really, kind of rapidly either falling up in the air or falling down. He was very unstable in his residence at that time. So he went to Noemi's to try to procure a residence, and again was rejected by her, number one, but also said something did not text when she said she was going to text law enforcement. She was going to call law enforcement, excuse me.
His dealings with Attorney Torres from the first right before the murder, did that have any effect on your reality testing?
Well, yes.
What was that?
Well, we know that on the 6th, the first day that he met with Ms. Torres, Mr. Jonchuck was described as being, by Ms. Torres as being fine, great, no problems. She described him as having a great memory, bringing back all kinds of information from the past concerning residence, address, things of that nature.
And did he contact her with emails on the night of the 7th?
Yes, he did.
And those emails concerned him paying money to her?
Yes, on the 7th at 8:27, it was taking care of business. He said that he wanted to bring the money over, and then laugh out loud. He knew that he was saying it too late because the office was closed.
Did he say his mother was going to bring the money over?
Yes, he said that actually his mother was going to bring the money over.
Okay. Was he found with money on him?
Yes, $100.
And did that money come from his mother?
Yes, he was planning to take care of business, yes.
Okay. And there was another email at 10:25?
Yes, that was at 10:25 on the 7th, and it was that I'll bring the $100. So I'm not ignoring what he said at Ms. Torres's office on the 7th, because I'm fully aware of that, where she became alarmed because he was talking about being the Pope and those sorts of things. But what I am getting, I'm expressing what I got as I read the records, is that there was a lot of give and take in terms of psychotic symptoms and reality testing. That there was unraveling clearly going on, but the degree was not severe.
Did you consider his contact with the priests on the 7th?
Yes, both of them.
Okay. We talked with Cesar Patella.
Yes.
Tell us about that encounter and how that affected your...
Well, I didn't speak with him. I reviewed his deposition.
Okay.
Yeah. So based on Father Caesar's deposition, that John was worried about the devil, and that he was worried about the devil. He described John as being worried about what's happening in the world today. He never discussed being possessed. He didn't discuss he or Phoebe being possessed by anything. He told Father Caesar that he was taking medication but stopped, and this made Caesar think he wasn't right. And he suggested that John see a professional. He indicated that John wouldn't listen to Caesar's thoughts or definitions of the devil, but disagreed about that definition. There was no discussion of the Pope or anything else. And Father Caesar said that during the conversation he looked perfectly okay. My interpretation is that he didn't present as being confused and, for lack of better terms, deranged in some way. Now, reading Father Caesar's deposition, there's clearly indication that Mr. Jonchuck wasn't right, but there's a big difference. Again, if you talk about unraveling, that he wasn't right, but he wasn't fully wrong. I guess that's the best way to put it. And again, there's mixed information during these critical time periods that have to be taken into consideration, and it's just not all psychotic.
Now, he had seen Father Caesar after he saw Father Swingross. Did you look at Father Swingross's depositions and
Yes,
reports?
yes, I did.
And what did that show you and how that impacts your evaluation?
Well, Dr. Swingross, Father Swingross's deposition, he described that Mr. Jonchuck clearly had mental health issues. He described him as anxious, but with a grasp on reality. He didn't ask for an exorcism. He didn't appear to be paranoid. There was no discussion of salts or rumors. He said he was the Pope, and he said he wasn't the Pope. I think that is a good that's a good indicator of the point I'm trying to get across. There was vasculation or instability with the psychotic symptoms. They were coming and going. They were definitely there. But to assume that they were all there and this other side of things was absent, I couldn't get that from reviewing all of the information. He even came back with his stepmother to prove that he had support concerning Phoebe, because it was with Father Swingross that the law enforcement came, and there was concern about Mr. Jonchuck's mental status earlier in the day. So when he came back, he wanted to prove that everything was okay, which I think shows, being in touch with things, that he didn't have to worry because he was God, he didn't have to worry because he was the Pope.
Any other factors that you looked at?
Well, I looked at the deposition of Officer Rizzo. That was the law enforcement officer that came to the church and for the possibility of the Baker Act. And they spoke for 20 minutes, and at that time, Mr. Jonchuck said he wasn't hearing voices, he appeared to be calm, he understood questions and responded appropriately. Obviously, he was not Baker acted. Now, even if Mr. Jonchuck was trying to present as being okay, he still had enough reality testing to differentiate and control himself. So any which way, in my opinion, again, I'm not saying that the psychotic symptoms weren't there, but there's another side to the coin. The law enforcement officer talked to the priest briefly, 5 minutes, and that's Father Swingross, and the priest said that Mr. Jonchuck made some odd statements, like, I'm the Pope, no, I'm not. And he was asking to become a church member.
Objection, hearsay, and may we approach?
Yes.
Thank you very much for your cooperation.
Jury's out of the hearing.
Okay, so we'll reconvene about 11:10.
All right, all rise. We're being recessed till 11:10.
Yes, sir, I'm sorry. Why don't you tell me who's coming? Well, he moved.